A Farewell to Flatbush. Hebel, in a surprising entry in his diary, asks what takes away life's magic in later years. It is because in all the brightly colored, contorted marionettes, we see the revolving cylinder that sets them in motion. And because for this very reason, a captivating variety of life is reduced to wooden monotony. So says Ted Adorno, and in spite of the indisputable veracity of this dire pronouncement, or perhaps because of it, neither one of us is able to remember exactly what we were doing when the long awaited phone call from Los Angeles finally came. Who did he call first, you or me? You mean Gary? Who else? Maybe we were together when the call came. Working on a song? Possible. So as it happened, we were working on a song when we got the call from California. Now that the album Can't Buy a Thrill is finally being released in its original glorious packaging, complete with all notes, text, photos, illustrations, etc., appropriately miniaturized for the digital medium of the day, we would like to avail ourselves of this opportunity to set the record straight on a few important points. Number one, the original members of the band were Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Realizing that this ensemble was a bit thin, it was decided to import to Los Angeles a few musicians of our acquaintance. Our producer, Gary Katz, suggested Jeff Skunk Baxter, whom we had actually met and played with back in New York, and Jim Hodder, whom we had not met but only seen at a recording session through the glass, darkly. Jeff's credentials included a brief stint with a Boston band called Ultimate Spinach, although to his credit he was not an original member of that outfit. Hodder hailed from Long Island, and he was a surviving member of a Katz-produced band called The Bead Game, named for the illustrious but unreadable Hess novel. Once these two potent talents had been added to the mix, the ensemble was still found wanting in several areas. So the call went out to Hicksville, Long Island, and jazz guitarist Denny Diaz was brought into the picture. Hicksville's loss was Steely Dan's gain, and for the next several months we thought we had everything we needed. More on this point later. 2. As for material, we had touched down in California with a fat notebook crammed with what we called the Dino. It was our opinion that this collection of songs, our life's work to date, would morph effortlessly into classic albums, swank long-running careers, juicy bank accounts, houses with swimming pools, powerful mid-engine sports cars, happiness, security, girls, girls, girls. In short, everything we needed to get by. In fact, it turned out later that only half the songs on the first Steely Dan album were already in the book. The rest were written in California, in a style which had been adjusted and refined to take into account the new musical environment in which we found ourselves operating, and also to reflect our belated understanding of the aesthetic shortcomings of some of our less than accessible, more doggedly surrealist efforts. 3. Our producer Gary Katz had preceded us in the move from New York to Encino. He had leased a nice Buick for himself on Dunhill's dime, Tobacco Brown, same model that Kojak drove on TV. Neither of us had cars or driver's licenses at that time, so we drove to work with Gary in the morning and back with him at night. It was during these drives that we became acquainted with the following record business concepts: a buck 380, capiloctomy, picking up the option, pick and roll, Harvey, you're fired, I got a guy, breaking out in England, power rotation, mo kick mo hat, show business heaven. 4. Jeff Baxter had a theory that one of the secretaries at the ABC offices had several sets of interchangeable breasts which she would alternate wearing from day to day. This turned out to be incorrect. 5. During our visits to the small recording studio adjoining the Dunhill offices, we were surprised and frightened to see a fellow dressed in an American flag shirt and matching pants working behind the console from time to time. Later we found out that he drove a small yellow Lotus sports car which he referred to as Screaming Yellow Zonker. He turned out to be engineer Roger Nichols. 6. We had this kind of cozy idea which went something like this. Our dyno, once polished to a higher luster, would be recorded by ourselves and our shiny new bandmates. When the album released, it would be a runaway hit, thus ensuring us unlimited funding for future albums. The royalties would flow directly into our checking accounts with no deductions or delays. All of this would take place without it becoming necessary for us to leave Los Angeles, where we could lead our modest but comfy lifestyles indefinitely. As it turned out, our career template was modeled on the likes of stay at home studio moles like Enoch Light and his Light Brigade, or Ken Nordine of word jazz fame, and more recently, the Beatles. So, when certain executives at ABC started pestering us about the tour, we were already halfway through with the recording of the first album. It came as a surprise to us that we were now expected to go out and perform in public. The surprise was not a good surprise, especially for Donald, who had reluctantly agreed to be the band's lead vocalist for the purposes of recording, but who was essentially terrified of singing in public and thus somewhat reluctant to be pressed into service as the frontman for a touring rock band. That's when the skunk called on his chum, David Palmer, and Dave came out from New Jersey to try out for the job. Luckily, the tracks for Dirty Work in Brooklyn were in his key, more or less. 7. We had worked with guitarist Elliot Randall in New York City. Elliot was a big-time studio cat at the time, as far as we could tell. We were planning on having spectacular guitar solos on a few of our tunes, so it was natural for us to ask Elliot to fall by when we found out he was in town. He did pretty well on the solos, so we asked him to join the band, even though we already had 2 or 3 guitarists. He demurred. Other people who turned us down: John Gordon, Loudon Wainwright III, some blue-eyed soul dude that Gary brought by one time, Rick Derringer, Chevy Chase, maybe Nils Lofgren, and Janice Baker a couple of times. 8. When we first met Denny out in Hicksville, he was playing a Gibson Barney Kessel hollow body guitar through a custom amplifier. The guitar was a sunburst with double Neo-Venetian cutaways and a fence to the eyes and the ears alike. We prevailed upon him to find something a bit more modern sounding, and he ended up trading in the Kessel for a Dan Armstrong guitar with a clear plexiglass body. This was okay for a while, but by the time Denny came out to California, we were hankering, on Denny's behalf, for another sonic upgrade. So Denny went down to Sound City, where Jeff Baxter was employed as a guitar repairman, and picked himself out a nice Fender Telecaster with a rosewood neck, fitted with the appropriate humbuckers in neck and bridge position, and amplified by a beefy Marshall 100-watt amp head and short stack cabinet. Denny was ready to rock, but we were still not satisfied, and so for the occasion of Denny's solo on Do It Again, we hired in a choral electric sitar. This novel instrument, replete with dual lipstick tube pickups and sympathetic strings, and a special bridge that produced the sitar-like buzzing sound, added that extra something that the tune called for. Similarly, Donald rented for himself a strange Yamaha organ that had, amongst other things, a felt strip for producing glisses that were heretofore unheard of on a keyboard instrument. 9. Because of our current situation, Italian restaurant, we are unable to audition the Can't Buy a Thrill album at this time. However, we do seem to recall a few highlights, which include Do It Again, a top 10 hit nationally, begun in Encino, finished in our ABC Dunhill writing dungeon. To say that the lyrics somehow emblematized the desperate career gamble on which we were embarking, to say that would be a bit precious. Let the latter-day listener draw his own conclusions. But it most definitely solidified what became a long and satisfying collaboration with percussionist/vibist/pianist Victor Feldman. The aforementioned Elliot Randall solo on Reeling in the Years, also a huge hit. That was a hell of a thing, wasn't it? And last but certainly not least, the Veal Bird special at Dolores Restaurant, a regular Thursday night favorite for the gang in Village Recorder's Studio A. To be continued. Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, 1998.